Then there's prime vending, which is preferred in restaurants and non-commercial settings. And it is a contract between a vendor and a buyer, but there's only one vendor to supply most of the goods that are needed. This is really beneficial because it saves money and time for the buyer, and it also helps build a rapport with the vendor you're working with, which ends up being good in the long run. Other purchasing variations include blanket purchase agreements, which include an unknown set of items at an unknown quantity and unknown price, but it helps build relationships between buyers and local vendors. So the contract other food purchasing variations include blanket purchase agreements, which are unknown items at an unknown quantity at an unknown price, but it builds a relationship between buyers and local vendors. And with this type of purchasing, you want to have multiple local vendors in order to prevent price creeping. And then lastly, there's just-in-time purchasing, which is when a buyer orders goods from a vendor as needed and the vendor delivers them just in time for the product demands at the restaurant. The goal with this type of purchasing is to not have too much in inventory in order to maximize cash flow. All right, so now I'm going to talk about product selection, which is how you choose the foods that you want to purchase. There are many factors that go into selecting the different foods that you want to purchase, but the most major one is the form of the food, which refers to a product's quality and state, like is it frozen, canned, fresh, is it whole or diced. The choice is made in the form and other factors that go into food selection depend on an organization's resources. So if they don't have very many employees to process through a lot of fresh food, they may opt for something that's diced already. This ends up looking like a balance between labor available, portion cost, and acceptability to the consumer. The other major part that goes into food selection is food quality. There are different quality standards that are denoted by desired grade, brand, and condition. The grade is a classification of the quality of a product in comparison to the standard that has been set by the USDA. Grading and acceptance services are provided for different buyers who want to see what goes into the quality and stuff of their vendors. So these services apply to meat products, fresh and processed fruits, poultry and eggs, and manufactured dairy products. So they go to the processing or packaging plant and assess the quality and make sure that it's meeting the standards set out in the contract. For more about grades and stuff and the definitions, there's a large chart in our book on page 174. Lastly, there are brands, which are created by private organizations to help themselves produce commodities and build demand for their products. This is interesting because they have their own set of standards, and so the quality can fluctuate more than their reputations have led us to believe.
Okay, so now that we've discussed some of the more formal definitions of what purchasing is and like some of the parts of the purchasing process, we're going to really kind of delve into the purchasing procedures a little more in depth. So as mentioned earlier, our book breaks it down into formal versus informal. However, although informal is more popular, formal is the procedure that's outlined in our book in most detail. So that's what this presentation is going to focus on. So the very first part of the purchasing procedure is identifying the needs. So the needs of a purchase are going to depend on the menu, the recipes, and the supplies that are needed. So what triggers this purchasing process is called a requisition, and that's an interdepartmental form used to request the desired product, including food and supplies. So once you've identified those needs and you've started your requisition form, you're going to take a look at what your inventory stock level looks like. So based on your inventory, you have to establish what your maximum inventory level should look like and what your minimum inventory level should look like. And that's going to vary depending on a few different factors. So depending on what your inventory looks like, you're going to stock it according to a system. So you can stock it on a par stock system or a mini max system. So the par stock system just means that anytime you stock up to a certain level, no matter how much is depleted or how much isn't depleted. You stock to the same place each time. The mini max system is a little different in that you can deplete your stock level to the bare minimum level that you've established, but every time you place an order, you restore it to the maximum level that you've identified. It's important, most of all, to consider like what's economically feasible. If you can stock to maximum each time in a way that's financially okay, that's perfectly fine to do. But if you can't, you may want to go with a par stock system approach. So the last part of identifying needs is knowing what quantity you need to purchase. So again, you rely on your menu and your recipe to tell you kind of what you need, but your quantity is going to depend on what your portion sizes typically look like, your projected number of servings, and then you have to take into account the losses that you may incur in preparation and cooking. Also, you have to think about the frequency of purchasing depending on who does the finance and accounting procedures, the method that you use to buy, the frequency of your deliveries, the amount of storage space that you have, and preparation requirements. And lastly, you have to consider the types of food that it is that you're wanting to buy, because different types of food like poultry, fresh produce versus frozen, canned produce, milk and eggs require different needs as they're being stored. So the next part, after you've identified what it is that you need, you have to write the specifications for what you need. So the specifications are detailed descriptions of the products that are clear and concise. This part of the process is all about eliminating any type of misunderstanding that can occur. So there are certain specifications that have to be included on all products, regardless of what they are. And that's the name of the product, the federal grade or brand, the unit on which the price is quoted, the size and type of unit, the name and the size of the container, and the count per container or approximate number per pound. Next is categories of food that have their own sort of specific specifications. So fresh fruits and vegetables, typically you have to mention what variety they are, the degree of their maturity, and the geographic location in which they come from. For canned foods, you have to talk about the type and style that's in the can, the package, the size, the syrup type, specific gravity, and Brix. Brix is really important when it comes to canned fruits, especially because if you've ever been to the grocery store, it will tell you whether your fruit is in 100% juice or light syrup or heavy syrup. And Brix is just the more formal term for like heavy syrup or light syrup, things of that nature. Frozen foods, the biggest part of that is the temperature, because you want them to remain frozen until the time it is that you need to use them. For meat and meat products, a lot of it is about the cut of meat, the type of meat, the age, how you are supposed to cut it, how you might want to prepare it, the fat content. And for dairy products, it's all about the milk fat content, bacteria, milk solid, and this one, also like frozen foods, also relies on temperature. So once you've identified your needs and you've written your specifications, it's time to develop your purchase order. So your purchase order is the written request to the vendor to sell goods or services to your facility. The order can be made based on purchase requests and quality specifications, and it can be compiled from various or single production and service units. So this is an example of what a purchase order form looks like. It can contain the quality of each item needed for the bid period, quality specifications, the date of delivery, the name of the organization, the name of the individual making the request, signature of the person authorized to make the order, and it has to have some type of identification. So as you develop your purchase order form, it's going to kind of go along with your issuing your bid request. This is, you develop your purchase order, but you attach it to your bid request, and once your bid request is accepted, then the purchase order form is officially accepted. So the middle step here is issuing your bid request. And that's an invitation that a food service provides to the vendor. And so they submit bids for specific items, and the requests originate in the office of the purchasing agent. So in a bid request, it will contain a lot of the same items from the purchase order form. So the quantities that you need, the specifications, the times, the date, but the bid request has a little bit more of the legal aspects to it as far as like terms of payment, discounts, any negotiation that might be required on behalf of the purchaser or the vendor. In a bid request, you can also request samples. This is typically done for canned foods in particular, because even if a vendor is using or a buyer is using canned foods, they still want it to be the highest quality possible. So sometimes they'll do a process called can cutting, where they request samples and they try the samples from each of the vendors that they have submitted bid requests to choose the best canned product. And lastly, you want to establish a bid schedule. You want your bid period to match up with whatever it is that you're seeking. So times for like fresh fruits and vegetables, the bid period might look a little different compared to the frozen foods or to milk products and things of that nature. So lastly, once all of your bids have been initiated, when you get them back, they'll be in a sealed envelope. They'll be stamped with time, date, and place of receipt, and you have to open them at the designated time for opening. If you receive a bid after that time, it has to automatically be rejected and returned to the bidder. The next part of evaluating the bids that you receive is kind of evaluating essentially whether or not they meet your needs and if they're upholding the parts of the bid that you requested. Lastly, you award your contract. So this is where you officially choose the vendor that you want to supply your needs. The contract should be awarded to the most responsible and responsive bidder who had the price that was the most advantageous for the purchaser. So all of this should be based on price, quality, and service. And an issued contract represents a legal and binding offer. So all bidders, whether or not they were successful and they're the bidder that you chose, have to be notified of whether or not they received a contract. And then there are listed some of the general conditions of the contract. Often it's just solidifying what was already written in the bid request and the order form. So our textbook stops here in the formal purchasing process, but there are 3 more steps. The first being receive and inspect deliveries, store in proper area, and evaluate and follow up.